Power, live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Amara Omokwe, I'm Joe Matthew. Tonight, the beautiful game comes to Washington, and with it, high-stakes diplomacy. President Trump kicking it with global leaders during the big World Cup draw today, with key issues at stake beyond the playing field. Also, K-pop demon hunters. Meet Game of Thrones. We'll take you inside the Netflix plan to buy Warner Brothers, a deal that stands to reshape the streaming industry. But with hurdles on the horizon, could there be a plot twist ahead? And born in the USA, will that still guarantee American citizenship? The Supreme Court now taking up the White House fight here and setting the stage for an historic ruling over the 14th Amendment. Plus, a Bloomberg exclusive, my conversation with House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries at the 11th hour here with a health care deal possible. We'll discuss it with the Democratic leader straight ahead. But we begin this evening here in Washington with Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum and Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney standing side by side with President Trump today at the Kennedy Center on stage for the FIFA World Cup draw. President Trump also receiving FIFA's inaugural Peace Prize. One of the worst kept secrets here in Washington after months of entreaties from FIFA President Gianni Infantino. Here's that moment.
We want to unite. That's what we do here today. That's what we'll do at the World Cup, Mr. President. And you definitely deserve the first FIFA Peace Prize.
Thank you very much. This is truly one of the great honors of my life.
Today's event marking the first face-to-face meeting between President Trump and Mexican President Sheinbaum since Trump began his second term. And while the World Cup was the primary focus, of course, tariffs and immigration were not far behind. The three leaders wrapping up a trilateral meeting a short time ago. And joining us now with more is Bloomberg's Michael Shepard. Shep, it's great to see you. Of course, it was all about football today in the Kennedy Center, but also hemispheric trade. Does it take the World Cup to have a breakthrough with these three?
To bring them all together? Yeah. It certainly did something to perhaps at least break the ice of some of the tensions that we've seen between the top two U.S. trading partners and closest neighbors, Canada and Mexico. You know, since taking office, we've seen President Donald Trump threaten to send the military after drug cartels in Mexico. We've seen the tariffs imposed on both Canada and Mexico over his concerns about fentanyl trafficking, and he's even threatened to make Canada the 51st state. More recently, Joe, of course, we've seen him threaten to pull the U.S. out of the USMCA trade agreement that was forged during his first term and is now up for review. So there is a lot at stake, and the two leaders really needed to do some work behind closed doors after meeting on stage for the World Cup draw as co-hosts of the tournament next year.
We saw the Mexican president, Claudia Sheinbaum, send out a post on X after the meeting about how well it went. What are we learning about what was actually discussed, and do we know if anything came out of that meeting?
Well, it's unclear what will come out, because what we're waiting for is really what degree of understanding they have on extending USMCA more broadly, but then getting to some of the stickier questions that surround cross-border trade. And a lot of that has to do with autos and auto parts, but then there are also the tech questions that are at stake too, because we have seen this massive flood of investment into tech, not only in the U.S., but also in Mexico. We've seen foreign makers from China and elsewhere really putting up Foxconn from Taiwan as well, putting up plants in Mexico to be closer to U.S. consumers and buyers there and buyers elsewhere in the hemisphere. How does that work out? And of course, the three sides will really have to overcome, you know, the Trump question and how they navigate some of the unpredictability of the administration and what his demands have been, especially when it comes to, you know, things like the drug trade that he has expressed a lot of concern about, and then also what is going on with Venezuela, and, you know, whether Claudia Sheinbaum can play some sort of role perhaps in maybe diffusing some of those tensions, but it will be very difficult. And of course, Canada has something of a say in that as well. So we'll have to be watching what emerges from it. But the signals today, at least in terms of what the Mexican president said and what we heard from President Donald Trump on stage, even indicated that there may be a little bit of a melting of the ice there.
You wonder if we end up looking back on this as a turning point. Shep, thank you so much. Bloomberg's Michael Shepard live in Washington tonight. And a blockbuster deal announced today in the entertainment industry that could change Hollywood as we know it, with Netflix agreeing to buy Warner Brothers Discovery in a marriage valued at $72 billion. Under terms of the agreement, Warner Brothers shareholders would receive $27.75 a share in cash and stock in Netflix, valuing the business north of $82 billion, including debt. Now, Warner Brothers would spin off cable networks like CNN and TNT into a separate company before concluding the sale of its studio and HBO to Netflix, if, of course, the deal is approved. And for a look at how this all played on Wall Street, we turn to Power Moves with Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick, who joins us live from World Headquarters in New York. Netflix has come a long way from the CDs and those red envelopes, Romaine.
Yeah, certainly so. Warner Brothers Discovery shareholders, they clearly like what they see. You see the shares moved higher by about 6% on the day. And we should point out, Joe, they were already up something like 140% just coming into today. But the red on your screen there for Netflix is indicative of some of the concerns that investors there have. The idea that Netflix might be spending too much. We talk about a $72 billion deal. This is the largest announced M&A deal of the year. It would also be the biggest media deal since at least the AT&T Time Warner mashup back in 2018. But more importantly, Joe, the amount of money that Netflix is said to be borrowing for this deal, upwards of close to $60 billion, that would be one of the biggest loans of its kind in history. And that's what's giving some people pause. Also giving people some pause, Joe, is this intersection of what's going on in Wall Street and what's going on in Washington. This is a deal that has to get past regulators. Elizabeth Warren has already spoken out against this deal. The Writers Guild of America has spoken out against this deal. And Paramount Skydance, which, of course, was a bidder for Warner Brothers Discovery asset, has also spoken out against this deal. So right now, this is going to be less about what investors want, Joe, and maybe to a certain extent about what the regulators and, more importantly, what the man in the White House wants.
And Romaine, there are reports that SpaceX is telling investors that it's aiming for a late 2026 IPO. What do we know so far? Yeah,
this is a big deal. I mean, this was back on the news, broken by our Bloomberg reporters about a new funding round for the company. This is a private company, of course. A new funding round would effectively take its valuation in the private markets to somewhere north, or close, I should say, to $800 billion. Of course, the undercurrent of all this is the idea of how long this company stays private. Right now, at that valuation, that would make it the most valuable private company in the world. Of course, Elon Musk controls that company. He also controls one of the biggest publicly traded companies in the world, Tesla. And it does look like, based on our reporting, that he does have ambitions to push SpaceX into the public market, which would also likely increase its valuation even further beyond what we're seeing in the private market.
Romaine, thank you, as always. Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick live in New York. The Netflix Warner Brothers deal is expected to face some big hurdles when it comes to antitrust. Joining us now to discuss this and more is Republican Congressman Scott Fitzgerald of Wisconsin, who chairs the House Subcommittee on Antitrust and Regulatory Reform, is also a member of the House Financial Services Committee. Mr. Chairman, it's good to see you. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. Where's your head on this? Do you plan to hold hearings on this deal?
Well, I think everybody should just take a deep breath. What we saw under the Biden administration was kind of an immediate knee-jerk reaction to say, anytime you had two major names and they looked like they were even discussing a merger, that oftentimes there was just an onslaught of criticism. And then what happened is once the regulators and the enforcers kind of took a look at it, it made sense for consumers. And I think that's where we're at right now. I mean, we were watching kind of this public discussion go on about whether or not Paramount would outbid Netflix. And now we find ourselves in a position where that did not happen. So we're I think I'm cautiously optimistic that this is still very much viable and probably could move forward.
Interesting. And indeed, the Biden administration struggled with several attempts to block mergers and acquisitions. The point, though, in principle, this does not appear too big to allow from your perspective.
It does not. And I've had not specific discussions about this deal, but discussions with both Ferguson and slaughter. And I think they too have said, listen, under a new administration, we're going to do the due diligence that is needed and required. But, we're not going to come right out of the gates and say that this is something that shouldn't happen. They're going to wait to allow things to play out, let the examinations happen, let the, like you said, the massive deal as far as the finance piece goes. But that may be where we're at. We're seeing, 62% of Americans right now are frustrated with the streaming services the way they exist. So the idea that combining some of these streaming services, which is part of this deal, wouldn't make sense. I think to somehow pull the rug out from underneath that right now just is not. No one's doing their job if that's the way this is being handled. So, let's see where we're at. Let's see where the White House is on this too. The president, this is typically the type of thing he likes to weigh in on, and we'll see where he falls on this as well.
Mm-hmm. Congressman, are there provisions or guardrails that you would like to see in this deal to ensure that it, in fact, doesn't harm consumers, that it doesn't raise prices for consumers?
Yeah, you talked about the $60 billion in borrowing. That is a large number. But again, as a member of financial services, we see mergers all the time within the banking industry that I would say could rival that. So it's not completely out of the realm. It might be in this industry, but again, I think, the numbers, again, need to be scrutinized. But, sometimes this merger stuff is healthy. Senator Warren has been against any type of merger under any type of corporate structure. So that's not surprising, the knee jerk. But I feel like we need to allow the enforcers to do their job.
But Congressman, isn't it important to be careful here? Because we know that Americans are concerned about their cost of living, both about the things that they need and the things that they want, like their entertainment. So isn't it important to consider the potential costs here for consumers if this deal does go through?
Yeah, I think it's really difficult to project kind of at the end of the day what this will mean for the actual price of a product that a consumer might actually want to purchase, because we've seen kind of projections on that in some of these other mergers, and it turns out just to not be accurate. So we need, again, I would say caution and pause on that front. You're right. The question of the price and the cost to consumers on just about any product or good right now is being scrutinized. But again, these streaming services is something that there's a lot of frustration on. The other area that we're involved in right now is the Sports Broadcasting Act, which again, when you talk about streaming, if you want to get somebody really riled up, talk to them about what they're paying for some of the channels and whether or not they can track their actual favorite sports team right now. It's very difficult for Americans, and as a result of that, there's a lot of frustration, I think, overall in that area.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask you, Congressman, about one of the other big issues that we've been talking about today, and that's health care, with the promised vote next week in the Senate on a Democratic plan that we haven't seen yet, although we understand it could be up to a 3-year extension of the enhanced subsidies. There are also competing plans from Democrats and Republicans. And I talked earlier today with leader Hakeem Jeffries on Capitol Hill. He was very frustrated and said that he didn't see a path to compromise between the two parties, as nobody's talking. Listen to what he said.
Part of the challenge with Republicans is that they've broken all of their promises. They indicated that they were going to lower costs. In fact, lower costs on day one. Costs haven't gone down in America. Costs have gone up. Housing costs are through the roof. Grocery prices through the roof. Electricity bills through the roof. Mm-hmm. And now, because my Republican colleagues refuse to extend the Affordable Care Act tax credits, we know tens of millions of people are about to experience dramatically increased health care costs.
Congressman Fitzgerald, I'm pretty confident you will not agree with anything that Hakeem Jeffries says about this, but I understand that Speaker Johnson is planning to put a Republican proposal on the table at some point before the end of next week. So I'd love for you to be able to speak for your side of the aisle now and tell us what you think should be in there and whether this can pass the House.
Well, let me just comment quickly on Leader Jeffries. Broken promises, that's what Obamacare is. It's a huge broken promise to the American people. Now, with that being said, we do need to pick up the pieces and figure out where we're going. Senator Schumer's 3-year extension is a non-starter. I don't even think he could possibly take himself seriously on that. It's got to be a negotiating platform for him. No one in D.C. thinks 3 years is even a serious idea. You're right. There's about 35, maybe they're up to 40 members, a bipartisan group that on Thursday kind of launched this idea that a 1-year extension that includes some reforms might be the way to go. I can tell you right now, I still do not support that, and I'm not aware of some of my more conservative friends that are have examined that program are there or even close to that. So we're in a place right now where the Speaker and the President of the United States need to come up with something that I think can garner enough support that once again the White House can put their full effort behind and make the case to members that this is a short gap kind of extension that could get us to a different place on the Affordable Health Care Act. But that has not happened yet, and the clock is ticking. We know that we've got 2 more weeks here to kind of pull this together. I think all the members understand that. We do not want to go anywhere near another shutdown. So with all that being said, I mean, I think the next 2 weeks are critical.
Well, we'd love to stay in touch with you on this, Congressman. Thank you for the insights this evening. Republican Congressman Scott Fitzgerald of Wisconsin. We appreciate the time. Coming up, we'll turn across the aisle for that conversation I mentioned, an exclusive talk with House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries. His thoughts about working with his Republican colleagues. But first, breaking news regarding the September 2nd Venezuela boat strike. The double tap, we'll discuss it all with Danielle Pletka of the American Enterprise Institute. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio alongside Amara Omokwe. I'm Joe Matthew. Thanks for being with us. Some breaking news now in the tense situation between the U.S. and Venezuela and the ongoing boat strikes. One in particular we've been talking about a lot this week from September, the initial strike that has come under great scrutiny. The New York Times now reporting new information, new details on that strike. After Pentagon Chief Pete Hegseth and the president confirmed the boat in the Caribbean was struck more than once, the Times now reporting video of the boat strike. Those who have seen it say it shows survivors of the military's first strike, quote, climbed atop the overturned hull and waved to something overhead. It's according to multiple people who have seen video of the attack. The Times reporting, quote, some of the people viewing the video thought the waving by the survivors could have been an attempt to surrender, unquote. Joining us now is Danielle Pletka, Distinguished Senior Fellow in Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Danielle, we didn't know we'd be talking about this because this just broke a couple of moments ago. If this information is true, how does it change the complexion of this story?
You know, I don't think it changes it that much. The challenge for us is not what happened. I think the challenge for us is whether the action that the president is taking towards Venezuela and towards these drug boats is considered legal. And depending on your perspective, you're going to either say, we are at war, these are competence. You know, for example, when Barack Obama would take out a terrorist convoy, he often would hit it twice and sometimes even 3 times, and that was considered perfectly legitimate. In this instance, it's not considered legitimate. And I think the distinction is between how we view terrorists and how we view narco traffickers. So if the president is indeed correct, we are involved in a war, then a second strike is legitimate. If we are in fact involved in the enforcement of crime, as many people think, then it's really not legitimate to take out survivors.
So this really becomes between a military action or a police action, I think is what you're telling us, Danielle. According to the Times reporting, the Secretary's contingency plans laid out that the military would in fact attempt to rescue survivors who appeared to be helpless, shipwrecked, or out of the fight. In this case, waving apparently to someone to surrender. Is this why we heard Democrats like Jim Himes calling this disturbing, that it was a case of murder?
Well, we're hearing Democrats call it disturbing and a case of murder because everything that we do, including going to the, out for fast food, has become politicized. Again, this was one of the first strikes by the Trump administration. So it's not entirely clear to me that if these men were on top of their boat and waving, they actually knew what was involved. Could they have been waving at a drone? Could they have been waving at others who they hoped would rescue them, who were also narco traffickers? I don't think we know, and I don't think the members of Congress know either. What they're saying is basically depends entirely on where they're sitting and on which side of the aisle, not on the facts of the case.
Danielle, like you're mentioning, members of Congress looked at this footage yesterday and came away with very different conclusions depending on what party they're in. So I wonder, how do we move forward in terms of resolving some of these questions around the legality of these strikes? What are the next steps?
Well, you know what the miserable answer is, right? Because it's not that what the president says is enough. It's not that what Congress says is enough. Now, in this day and age, we wait for the courts. And part of the challenge here is that the president does have fairly unlimited authority as commander-in-chief to be able to order, to be able to take us to war, to be able to have a finding that we are in armed conflict and that these groups are terrorists. In those definitions, the Pentagon is within its rights. The challenge to that has to take place in the courts, and I think it's going to be very difficult because the courts don't want to run the country. They don't want to make foreign policy decisions that rightly, constitutionally, are in the purview of either the president or Congress. And so we're left in exactly the same place that we always are on almost everything.
Danielle, the administration has emphasized over and over that they have intelligence that the people on these boats are, in fact, trafficking drugs. Are we right to place confidence in what the administration is saying? How can we be sure that the people on these boats are actually doing the things that the administration is saying they are?
Look, we can't be sure of anything. Was the man that the Obama administration had killed in Pakistan, Osama bin Laden? Do you believe the intelligence? Do you believe that January 6th was actually a riot or that it was organized by Nancy Pelosi? Again, what you think depends on where you sit. It has not been American tradition to question the intelligence pronouncements, both of our intelligence community and of the White House. The second that we start saying that, the second that we start disbelieving absolutely every word that comes out of the mouth of the President of the United States, we have a much bigger problem than Venezuela.
Well, we might be there, Danielle. You know, the president did say that he supported the public release of this video. Do you take him at his word?
Yes, I do. I think that Donald Trump's general view of such things is, I saw it, I believe it, and if I believe it, I'm right, other people will see it my way. And in fact, that is what we saw, that people, now Republicans, and it's more important to say that when Republicans were critical of him, they hadn't seen the video. After the briefing from the Pentagon, Republicans like Roger Wicker, who is the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, who is a straight shooter, not, a sycophant for the president, he said he had been uncomfortable. Once he saw the video, he was much more comfortable with the narrative and questioned the press reporting that had initially come out in the Washington Post. And so, again, I respect Roger Wicker. Do we want to believe him? Depends where you sit.
Sure. Depends where you sit. Danielle Pletka, Distinguished Senior Fellow, Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the AEI. We thank you for being part of our conversation this evening. And coming up, my exclusive one-on-one with House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries. His critiques against his Republican counterparts and the rising cost of goods. All next. And only here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Thanks for joining us alongside Amara Omokwe. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Next week, we'll bring a promised Senate vote on extending Obamacare subsidies beyond the expiration at the end of this month. But there are big questions about what Democratic plan will actually reach the floor and whether it will get a vote in the House. I went up to the Capitol earlier today to talk about the health care standoff, among other issues, with House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, who says Republicans refuse to sit down with Democrats to find a bipartisan resolution. Here's a piece of our exclusive conversation.
Part of the challenge with Republicans is that they've broken all of their promises. They indicated that they were going to lower costs. In fact, lower costs on day one. Costs haven't gone down in America. Costs have gone up. Housing costs are through the roof. Grocery prices through the roof. Electricity bills through the roof. And now, because my Republican colleagues refuse to extend the Affordable Care Act tax credits, we know tens of millions of people are about to experience dramatically increased health care costs. Democrats are actually the party focused on driving down the high cost of living.
So let's talk about a couple of those points of leverage that you just pointed out. Affordability and health care. Many would argue that it's kind of the same story here. President Trump has been saying that affordability is a Democrat hoax, a Democrat con job. Does that mean you do not have Republicans on board with you in reforming health care or extending Obamacare subsidies?
It appears that way. It's unfortunate that the president's position, which is the Republican Party's position, is that the affordability crisis in the United States of America is a con job and it's a hoax. No, what was a con job and hoax was the fact that Republicans spent all of last year claiming that they were going to lower the high cost of living in the United States of America, that they were a party committed to addressing the inflationary pressure that the American people were under. That's all they talked about last year. But they lied to the voters. That's the con job.
You lied.
They absolutely lied to the voters because there's no evidence throughout this year that they've had any intention to actually address the affordability crisis that exists. In fact, they now say it's all a hoax. But everyday Americans, when they go to the grocery store, the supermarket, when they see their health care premiums dramatically increasing, when they see the electricity bills that they have, which are through the roof in part because Republicans in their one big ugly bill attacked the clean energy economy at a time in America where we have growing power needs in terms of what we see with the expansion of artificial intelligence. It's all extraordinary. So Republican leadership has made it clear they have no intention to extend the Affordable Care Act tax credits, and that's very unfortunate.
You know what the White House would say? Hold on, Leader Jeffries. This president's been working overtime to cut deals to lower the cost of prescription drugs. Does he deserve credit for that effort?
We haven't seen any evidence that prescription drug prices have gone down in any meaningful way. What we have seen are that the Trump tariffs are out of control. They've increased costs by thousands of dollars per year on everyday Americans, and they've created an uncertain environment for businesses and corporations throughout the country. And we know that uncertainty is one of the biggest problems that American corporations and companies may face. It's difficult to actually make investments when you have this chaotic environment that has been visited upon the economy.
So let's talk about what you can get done before the expiration of these subsidies at the end of the month. A bill was introduced yesterday, a framework that was bipartisan. A Democrat and a Republican, Gottheimer and Kiggins. It would extend these subsidies for a year and put new collars on eligibility. Is this a path to renewal in your eyes?
Well, we'll have to take a look at the particulars in the four corners of that bill. 214 Democrats have signed a discharge petition that will extend the Affordable Care Act tax credits for 3 years and give the American people the certainty that they need in order to move forward during these otherwise uncertain times. All we need are 4 Republicans. There are 219 of them. All we need are 4 House Republicans to join us, and we can extend the Affordable Care Act tax credits. We also want to take a look at what happens in the Senate. I'm thankful for Leader Schumer and Senate Democrats who will put a bill forward next week and force an up or down vote on an extension of the Affordable Care Act tax credits. You know, we're in this fight until we win this fight on behalf of the American people, because in the wealthiest country in the history of the world, it cannot be the case that working class Americans and middle class Americans are unable to afford to go see a doctor when they need one.
Are you in touch with the Speaker of the House on this? Is Mike Johnson talking to you about a potential vote after John Thune promised a vote on health care in the Senate for next Thursday?
You know, the big challenge with House Republicans has been that they've adopted a my way or the highway approach. They have zero interest in actually sitting down and finding a bipartisan path forward. We've said from the very beginning of this year and throughout the Trump Republican shutdown that we will sit down with anyone, anytime, any place here in the Capitol or go back to the White House, sit with the president to try to figure out how we can fix our broken health care system and address the Republican-created health care crisis that's devastating people all across America. They've refused.
You can find my full conversation with Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries online or on the terminal. Joining us now with their reaction to our conversation with the Democratic leader and the other stories percolating today in Washington, this evening's political panel. Bloomberg Politics contributor Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital, our Republican strategist alongside Democratic strategist Doug Farrer, founder of Maywood Strategies, former director of public affairs, the FTC. Gentlemen, it's great to see you both, and thanks for being part of the conversation. Rick, where's your gut here on health care reform on Capitol Hill? Patrick McHenry told us earlier today that there would likely be no deal and that there would be no extension of subsidies because of the political pressures both parties are facing going into the midterm elections. What do you think?
Yeah, we've seen this a little bit before. There's no consensus inside the Republican caucus in the House of Representatives on a plan. You mentioned, the Gottheimer, Kiggins deal. Fitzpatrick's working on stuff. Other members have been trying to promote a deal, extend 1-2 years the credit and then, reform the system. And it's mostly these people who are worried about reelection, folks in districts that, are on the bubble and after Tuesday's election see nothing positive happening with their own electoral prospects. And so they've hit the panic button, with 10 legislative days to go. I would agree. I don't think there's any way in 10 days of working time that this Congress is going to find a common ground, which they would need to find in order to pass any kind of reforms related to this ACA credit.
Rick, President Trump is set to do a push on his economic agenda next week, including taking a trip to Pennsylvania. What credible argument can Republicans and the president make on the economy and affordability if they don't have a message on health care, if they're not advancing a plan for health care?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. I mean, the president himself out of the White House circulated a plan to extend these ACA credits. And the conservatives around Mike Johnson rebelled against it, and they withdrew it. So we're now seeing a real anxiety within the caucus that Trump himself cannot just wave the magic power wand and get people to do what they need to do. And at the end of the day, Donald Trump's not on a ballot again in his life. And so he's going to, I think, look to try and fix this problem, but he's not going to take a lot of gas for it. I mean, basically, the White House has told these guys, Thune and Johnson, fix the problem, get something done. And if they don't, it does expose themselves to the talking points that you just heard from Jeffries on, Republicans have turned a blind eye on health care and obviously throws that in the package of affordability, because if these ACA credits expire by the end of the year, people are going to see massive increases in the cost of healthcare, and especially the same people who Trump is hoping show up and save some of these Republicans in the midterms.
So, Doug, let's bring you in here on healthcare. We've got 2 weeks to figure this out with the big cliff coming. Will there be a solution? Is it darkest before dawn here, or are they too politically entrenched to figure it out?
Well, I want to take a page from Rick's former boss, John McCain, who said it's always darkest before it's pitch black.
Oh, boy,
I'm pretty concerned. I think, the president's boxed them in. He said the affordability problem is a con, right? And Democrats certainly want to deliver on health care for their constituents, but I think Republicans are in a cul-de-sac of their own making. They've been voting 70 times to overturn the Obamacare law. They have been promising a plan. They haven't delivered it. And so I'm really concerned about their ability to deliver, but also about the people who are going to face these huge cost increases, as Rick mentioned.
Doug, in the early months of the Trump administration, there was a lot of criticism for Democrats that they didn't have a message. What was the driving force in the Democratic Party? Do you feel like this issue is giving them something to coalesce around, that they're finding their stride a little bit with this issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think healthcare is a good example of the overall affordability crisis that Democrats were successfully using in the recent elections that we saw go their way. I think what I'm looking to see now is a little more meat on the bone of how, if they do get the House or win elections down the line, that they're actually going to deliver, because I think that's really where the rubber meets the road. And the American people clearly need solutions for a lot of these problems: healthcare, food prices, you name it. And so it'll be good for Democrats to now put their thinking caps on and start to think about how they're going to deliver an agenda. I
want to ask you both about the big deal announced today, Netflix, Warner Brothers. Rick, we spoke earlier with the chair of the antitrust subcommittee, Congressman Fitzgerald. spent more time talking about where the Biden administration went wrong with mergers and acquisitions than he really did about this deal, but seemed to express no concern over this and has no plans to hold hearings, at least not yet. What kind of pressure will this deal face in Washington?
Yeah, we seem to be living in an era that is reminiscent of pre-Teddy Roosevelt, where massive corporations were able to consolidate and hold incredible sway over consumers and the financial system. And long gone are the days that my old boss John McCain would be fighting for a la carte on some of this cable work, because all he wanted to do was just buy ESPN. He didn't want all the rest of that junk. And so, yeah, I think it's going to affect people's choice. And if people are unhappy with the choice, especially because it's going to cost them more to have less choice, I think there's going to be a lot of anxiety around it. But Washington seems to turn a blind eye to that. Maybe the next president, needs to be a trust buster like Teddy Roosevelt and take a look at all these things. Look, I'm for commerce. I think what they're doing is appropriate because they're giving liquidity to shareholders who've been invested and they've built good businesses. But at some point in time, there's got to be a balance to the consumer on that.
Doug, we heard from both Republicans and Democrats today who are already opposing this deal. What do we know about how it might affect consumer choice? What are we hearing from people in Congress about their concerns about consumer choice?
Sure. I mean, if you look at the deal, this would combine the first and third largest streamers by volume. This would be 34% of all U.S. streamers, U.S. customers of video on demand. And so it's facially illegal based on the Clayton Act, right? And we can start there. I think the thing that is interesting is you saw bipartisan groups of members of Congress, Elizabeth Warren, Mike Lee, come out with concerns. In this administration, I think ultimately the decisions about all of these things, because of the way they've set up the government, is done in the White House. And normally you'd have an independent agency review or the DOJ antitrust division. But here, I think the White House has such a heavy hand in these decisions that ultimately it'll be up to President Trump. I know he's expressed some interest in seeing Paramount make this acquisition. Yeah. So, I think we've got two separate tracks, right? We've got the law, which it seems to be probably illegal, and then politics, and that's a black box.
Interesting. You, of course, spent time at the FTC, as we mentioned on the way in here. What if he gets a phone call from Larry Ellison? Does this whole deal change before our eyes?
Well, it's possible, right? I mean, we've certainly seen a lot of deals go through with odd settlements or with other certain sort of very political outcomes that didn't seem to make much sense to lawyers or economists. So I think, businesses understand that it's possible that they can get deals through despite the potential illegality if they have good purchase with the president, and they seek to acquire that through means that are, frankly, a little concerning if you're worried about, a fair and equitable regulatory process.
Well, it was a big mover today, and it's a story that's very important to our audience, so we'll keep tabs on this. With the help of Rick Davis and Doug Farrar, a great panel, we thank you both for the insights tonight on Balance of Power. Have a great weekend. Coming up, we look ahead to next week's Fed meeting and the prospect of the central bank cutting rates now for a third straight time. We'll discuss with Michael Faulkender, former Deputy Treasury Secretary in the Trump administration. He's up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio alongside Amara Omokwe. I'm Joe Matthew. Thanks for spending part of your Friday with us. We'll look ahead to next week's Fed meeting coming up in just a moment. But first, the stories we're watching in today's Power Brief. The Vaccine Advisory Committee, hand-selected by HHS Secretary RFK Jr., voted today to revoke the CDC's longstanding recommendation that all newborns receive hepatitis B shots within 24 hours of birth. The vote allows parents to delay that shot for at least 2 months if the mother tests negative for the virus and use blood tests to determine whether further shots are warranted, though there is no evidence that showing such tests can prove a person's immunity. Shares of Merck and GSK, which make the hepatitis B vaccine for children, fell on that news.
And Brazilian stocks tumbled the most since 2021, and the country's currency sank 2.5% today after former President Jair Bolsonaro backed one of his sons in next year's presidential election. Bolsonaro surprised investors who had been counting on him endorsing a different candidate to unify right-wing voters and block a fourth term for leftist President Lula da Silva.
And a federal judge in Florida granting the DOJ's request to unseal grand jury transcripts from the original criminal investigations into Jeffrey Epstein, despite pushback from Ghislaine Maxwell. This decision follows the passage of the Epstein Transparency Act last month, which requires the release of all materials and records related to Epstein's 2019 death in prison. Two judges in New York are currently considering similar requests to unseal transcripts from the investigations that resulted in the 2019 indictment.
And all eyes will be on the Fed next week as they hold their final FOMC meeting of the year. Markets are bracing for a rate cut, but let's take a listen to what some analysts on Bloomberg had to say this morning.
Markets are looking sort of short term, right? They know that there's going to be another, or think that there's going to be another Fed rate cut in December.
We do expect the Fed to cut next week, and we expect 2 more cuts next year.
We don't think the Fed should be cutting rates at every meeting from now until next June.
Whether it's Hassett, whether it's Warsh, whether it's Waller, I don't think the trajectory of Fed policy is dramatically different over the next 12 months here.
Joining us now here in our Washington bureau with his insight is Michael Faulkender, former Deputy Treasury Secretary under the Trump administration and professor of economics at the University of Maryland. Michael, thanks for joining us.
Great to be back.
So we got some inflation data this morning. It was a little dated because of the government shutdown. But if you look at PCE inflation, headline and core, 2.8%, above the Fed's target. What is the argument for cutting right now?
I think the argument is that we're also seeing weakness in the job market. So the ADP numbers were less than impressive earlier this week, suggested that we actually lost jobs in the private sector. We're still waiting for the Bureau of Labor Statistics to come out with the official numbers, but it does seem like we're seeing, less. We are seeing inflationary pressures reducing. I think if you see energy prices have been under control, there is a belief, I think rightly, that the pressure on housing is coming down. And so over the last couple of years, the shelter component of inflation has been elevated. And we know that the shelter component is measured with a lag. And so it does seem like there's some downward pressure on housing, that's going to give us a lower base of inflation going forward. So I think that if you were to balance those two components, the employment piece with the forward-looking pressure on prices, I think that there's reason to steer towards a rate cut.
You were in the Trump administration, so if the argument is that the Fed should be cutting because of weakness in the labor market, does that undercut the president's argument that the economy is actually doing well, that we have an economic renaissance, as he likes to say?
Well, I think that first of all, I agree with Secretary Bessent that that the Trump administration has put enormous foundation in place for a very strong 2026. We know that because of the timing of the big, beautiful bill, that the refunds are going to come around the end of the first quarter, beginning of the second quarter. We know there's a delay in realizing the benefits from deregulation. We know that they are trying to open up energy leases in order to bring additional energy abundance into the economy. And so and also just the rebalancing of some of these trade situations that we have around the world, the impacts of those on the economy are going to be positive, but they're going to be occurring with a lag. And so the other piece I would say is if I look at that ADP report, you are starting to see some of the churn that's going to happen in the job market from the application of artificial intelligence. And so all of those things point toward there being opportunities for growth and productivity improvements, but that there is going to be some delay in that fully being realized. But that's why I look at it and say there's a lot of tailwinds going into the economy that should be disinflationary. And so I would tend towards a rate reduction if I were sitting on the Fed right now.
We talked yesterday with Claudia Sahm. It was an interesting conversation. Of course, economist, New Century Advisors, who said it's not so much about next week. We'll give you that rate cut. But what happens after that? Listen to what she said.
I would say a cut is highly likely, but I also think there's a very high likelihood that they'll be signaling a likelihood that they'll pause after that. They're going to want to see a lot more information. They will have completed 75 basis points of cuts, and we haven't seen any improvement on inflation this year, right? So the reason there's so much disagreement is it's a really tricky situation for the Fed with concerns about the labor market and concerns about inflation at the same time. So I do think they will do another cut, but I think they're going to really tell us, hey, we've taken in the insurance, and now we're going to see how this plays out.
of a different way to look at what you were just saying, Michael. So what a job for Jay Powell next week. What does he say in the news conference to signal that, to telegraph potentially a pause in a desert of data?
I think he is going to say we're going to be data-driven, but because there are these lags in realizing a lot of the information, that until we kind of get caught up from some of that information gap that occurred during the shutdown, that they are not going to provide too much forward guidance. I've always also been one that thought that the Fed should step away from all of the forward guidance it provides because it does not allow them to be as data dependent as they otherwise should be. They end up committing themselves sometimes to things that they cannot fulfill because the data comes out that requires a modification. So I think that you're going to see the next Fed chair maybe be a little bit more cautious on how much forward guidance they do and maybe get back to focusing more on the current rate change rather than trying to tell markets where they're going to go when they can't be certain about where the data is going to take them.
There are several people in the Trump administration who are offering critiques of the Fed, like you just did about forward guidance. Treasury Secretary Bessent came out this week and said the regional Fed president should live in their district for at least 3 years before they're appointed to that job. When you hear the Treasury Secretary and others in the administration criticizing the Fed like this, calling for widespread reforms, what are the problems that they're trying to address?
Right. So I think that I think people really have under-focused on the piece that he put out on the growth of the Fed and the activity it's going to. I think he called it gain of function at the Fed. And because if you look at what the Fed's original mandate was, it was to balance price stability with employment. But as they have started getting involved in additional activities, so for instance, under Dodd-Frank, they took over supervision of bank holding companies, but also as they expanded their toolkit and got into the long end of the yield curve, which many people would argue is more of a fiscal policy type of activity, they, I would argue rightly, and the Secretary has said the same, brought themselves under more political oversight. If you're going to deviate from just a pure monetary policy, narrowly looking at the balance between employment and price stability and expand your mandate, you should know that greater oversight is going to come with that. So their very actions, I think, have brought into question the amount of independence that they should appropriately have versus the extent to which there should be oversight from political appointees.
When you consider decisions the next Fed chair will have to make in our remaining 30 seconds or so here, is that Fed chair Kevin Hassett?
You know, I have always thought that Kevin was the leading candidate because I think the president thinks that one of his biggest mistakes in the first term was going with somebody he did not know. And of the candidates that Secretary Bessent has made public, clearly the one that the president has gotten to know the most is Kevin Hassett. And so Kevin's a friend. He's been a longtime mentor of mine, and I think he would be great at it. But I also think that he's got the edge.
Fascinating. Great to see you again. Michael Faulkender back with us, the former Deputy Treasury Secretary of the Trump administration. We appreciate the insights, as always. Quick programming note, make sure you tune into a brand new Wall Street Week with David Weston, where tonight's episode showcases the impact of the protests that occurred in Nepal earlier this year and how Gen Z was at the center of that movement. It's all coming up next, 6 p.m. Eastern, right here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Amara Omokwe, thanks for hanging with us this week. This is Bloomberg.